Hey, Mark here from St. Stephen's University. We recently had a 2-day Red Room event called Towards a Decolonizing Faith, and today we're bringing you a talk by one of the speakers, Matt Balcarras. Now, Matt is an SSU alumnus. He is a neuroscientist. He's a writer and a teacher, and his focus is on peacemaking and hidden violence in church and society. So you'll hear Matt do a brief history of colonization in Canada. Then Matt talks about how colonization affects our thinking and our actions depending on which side of the table we sit. And then he wraps up with questions about our brains and how we can learn new things that change us when we approach issues and topics like colonization. So that's enough from me. I'm going to get out of the way. Here is what I would call a face-melting chat by Matt Balcarras.
I would be much happier to be here if I didn't have snow. I was very excited to participate in this event, and I had no idea really what it was going to be about, and really no idea what Joel had to say. We might sound very different, but I think there's a lot of interesting connections, so we'll see what happens. I want to start by situating myself. We all come to this conversation here today with specific histories and commitments. We come from communities with different opportunities and different limitations. Nobody comes to a conversation from nowhere. So it's important that I don't start talking about colonialism or decolonization without recognizing my relationship to the issues at hand. I live in the traditional territory of the Tsawwassen and Musqueam on the edge of the Salish Sea in a town called Ladner. Ladner is named after Thomas and William Ladner, who settled on that land in 1868, and they claimed ownership of more than 300 acres through a process called preempting, which just meant registering surveys of unclaimed land with the Land Title Registry Office. When the Ladners claimed ownership and began to farm, the Tsawwassen and Musqueam, who had lived on that land for thousands of years, were not consulted or compensated. They did not negotiate with the Ladners or the government. They did not fight someone and lose the land. The Ladner brothers simply paid $1 an acre to the government of British Columbia and registered their surveys. The same government simultaneously denied the right of the Tsawwassen and all other indigenous peoples in British Columbia to claim their land. In 1958, 90 years after settlement began and the reserve lands of the Tsawwassen and Musqueam were established, the government of British Columbia decided to build a new terminal for the Vancouver Island ferry route. And they decided to do this by removing the Tsawwassen Nation longhouse and putting in its place a causeway and an island that extends from the Tsawwassen Reserve. If you've gone to Vancouver Island from Tsawwassen, you've driven there. The Tsawwassen First Nation was not compensated or consulted for this invasion of their land. Currently, 1/4 acre lots in Ladner are worth between $800,000 and $900,000. I know. This is an incredible increase in property value made possible by the existence of fee simple title ownership. The system fee simple title formally assumes that property ownership originates in something called the Crown, an assumption known as a legal fiction that means that the land was never owned by anyone prior to the Crown. The Crown, which in Canadian terms just means our government now, assumes the right to sell land it did not always have to pay for. It's worth noting that reserve land, such as land lived on by the Tsawwassen in 1958, are not fee simple properties, but are instead held and controlled by the Crown in trust for Indigenous peoples. Settlers have benefited from living on that land in ways that the Indigenous inhabitants have not. I am a settler, which in one sense means that I've descended from people who have arrived here more recently, but more importantly, it means to me that I participate in systems that benefit me more than they cost me, and they benefit me more than they benefit the Indigenous inhabitants of the land that I live on. And when I acknowledge my relationship to the people whose territory I live on, I don't just name that place, I name the complex and unjust situation we both live in. In addition to situating where I'm speaking from, it's also important to say something about who I'm speaking to. Situating myself as a settler means I direct my comments to myself and my community and other settlers. My posture towards my Indigenous neighbors, the Tsawwassen and Musqueam, is one of listening and learning. One other thing I should say about situating myself is that I trained as a philosopher and a scientist, not as a theologian or a historian. And it's important for me to say this because I need to identify those subjects and methods I know something about and where the boundaries of my expertise lie. I come to today's discussion from the perspective of someone who primarily thinks about scientific methods for understanding human biology and mental machinery. Of course, my work depends on the work of many others, like historians and theologians and indigenous elders, and much of what I have to say is drawn from the work of people like Art Manuel, Paulette Reagan, Chelsea Vowell, Tayake Alford, and so many more. So, when presented with this question, like decolonizing our faith, my situated skill set encourages me to ask questions like, what is the link between colonialism and our thinking? What does colonized thinking look like, and how does it affect our behavior? And maybe most importantly, will my efforts to decolonize my thinking drive real change in the structures that enable ongoing colonialism? As a woman, I follow Chelsea Vowell. I don't know how to pronounce her name, she's Métis, and I would show something that she wrote, but it has profanity, and she says, F decolonization. Change your thinking, but don't change any of the structures. F that. Talk to me when we're talking about land. In recognition of the fact that our remarks today are meant to be introductory, I'd like to read a few words that would help frame my contribution to this conversation. I have two passages I'm going to read to you, very short, and keep in mind that these were read by the same person. Maybe ask yourself, who would have said these things? So first, in 2009, this person said, we are a very large country. We have one of the longest standing democratic regimes in history. We also have no history of colonialism. So we have all the things that people admire about the great powers, but none of the things that threaten or bother them. It's 2009. 2008, the year before, this same person said, the legacy of Indian residential schools has contributed to social problems that continue to exist in many communities today. The burden is properly ours as a government and as a country. There's no place in Canada for the attitudes that inspired the Indian residential school system to ever prevail again. Any guesses?
Stephen Harper.
That's correct. Stephen Harper said both of those things. What does it mean that 1 year after apologizing on behalf of the government and the people of Canada for one of the most egregious parts of colonialism, mandatory state-sponsored residential schools designed to eliminate the culture and language of Indigenous children, what does it mean that 1 year later, this same person denied that Canada has a history of colonialism? Is this just a case of a politician being a politician? Or is this a case of sort of cognitive dissonance, the inability of someone to see how they can believe contradictory things? My assumption about politicians is that they're politicians all the way down. No offense to politicians that are here. But I also think that this is an example of our ability to live with internal inconsistencies. It's not uncommon for people to denounce wrong or bad beliefs and then to act in ways that embody these same beliefs without noticing the discrepancy. Is it possible to both condemn colonialism and not see how we still benefit from it and perpetuate it? Of course. I think that this example can help us enter into the problem, though, of how we act in ways that demonstrate beliefs and commitments we don't even know that we have. Perhaps we doubt Mr. Harper's sincerity, but we probably don't doubt our own, even though we might have displayed similarly inconsistent behavior. Scientific work that I've done has taught me that humans are not very good at understanding our own cognitive processes. We're not very good at understanding our behavior and its causes. So what is colonialism? As a scientist, I spend a lot of time thinking about methodology, the processes we use to ask and answer questions, which in this context means we need to define some key terms so we know what we're going to explore. And defining key terms also helps me target the parts of the problem I think I can address with my skill set. However, defining colonialism is like defining other contested terms. Defining terminology is not a neutral action. The act of defining is laden with power. For example, if you define racists as those people that wear white hoods and burn crosses, you might then be able to deny that politicians who introduce a poll tax that bars potential voters who just happen to be black are not racist. They're not racist because they're not doing the things that we defined as indicative of racists. They're just raising government revenues. This is why it's important to start discussions of things like colonization, decolonization, with the recognition that how we start the conversation largely determines where we will end up. From my reading, and this is not necessarily an area of my expertise, it appears that the common conceptions of colonialism in Canada include ideas like it was historical, as in colonization happened in the past, the distant past. It was about overt forms of control like fighting and reserves and the settlement of the prairies. And it was mostly about controlling territory. We don't really have enough time to completely unpack the complex dimensions of colonialism. That could be a lot of work in itself. Following many Indigenous writers and scholars, I would suggest these ideas aren't sufficient. And it's important to recognize that colonialism is it's both something historical and it's ongoing. It's both about things like residential schools, but it's also about the current overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prison and in child welfare systems. It's both about overt forms of controlling people, such as federal legislation like the Indian Act and the banning of cultural practices, but it's also about covert forms of control like chronic underfunding of on-reserve education and health infrastructure. Colonization is certainly about controlling territory. It is most definitely about land, resources, and money, but it's also the framework by which control of these things is enabled and justified. So what then does thinking formed by colonialism look like? Considering the multidimensional nature of colonialism, here's a few suggestions. It's seen in the processes that create explanatory and justificatory frameworks for controlling territory. An example of this is something like the papal bull Inter Caetera, or the doctrine of discovery, that provided a moral and legal framework for land theft. Colonized thinking is also seen in the mental processes that covertly control people. For example, when Indigenous people describe the experience of being racially profiled by law enforcement, colonized thinking enables settler denial that this experience happens, or the ability of settlers to explain these experiences away without referring to the racial dimensions of a colonized society. Colonialism enables settlers to perceive the world in a way that benefits us at the expense of Indigenous people, while simultaneously enabling the denial that settlers receive any unfair systematic advantage or that Indigenous people are systematically disadvantaged. So what can I add to this discussion? I am a neuroscientist. I usually prefer to point to pictures of brains. And my work is largely focused on how the body, and especially the brain, is involved in perception, in learning, and decision-making. But I have some preliminary ideas about how some of my scientific work might help us understand how colonialism affects our thinking. How it affects our thinking specifically through foundational myths. Myths that assume untrue things about how our cognitive processes actually work. In the introduction to her book, Unsettling the Settler Within, Paulette Reagan, the Director of Research for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, says that in her work she unravels the Canadian historical narrative and deconstructs the foundational myth of the benevolent peacemaker, the bedrock of settler identity. Reagan's work is a force to be reckoned with. This book, Unsettling the Settler Within, is full of receipts. And her work deserves a discussion in its own right, but her analysis of the myth of the peacemaker as a part of settler identity has gotten me thinking about other myths of colonialism. What are the unacknowledged or unseen foundational beliefs of colonialism that influence our social interactions and our social structures? So I have one example. The Criminal Code of Canada is an inheritor of the common law tradition. And in this tradition, criminal behavior, the guilt of an individual, is determined by proving the existence of two equally necessary elements, the actus reus and the mens rea. Who's got Latin? This is the guilty act and the guilty mind. Criminal guilt, like a conviction for murder, is determined by the evidence of both of these things, a criminal act and the evidence that you had an internal mental disposition, an intent to do murder. Determining the existence of an intention to do murder in the mind of another person is a difficult thing to do. Is there a scientific way to do this? No. And even if there was, that's not how our courts actually operate. Courts use the judgment of people to determine the likelihood that someone else had a criminal mind when they committed a wrongful act. Of course, we estimate the likelihood of criminal intentions through the mechanisms of our sensory systems that have been formed in environments with complex social histories. For example, imagine you are a juror who's grown to believe that indigenous people are just a bunch of drunk Indians and they're lazy thieves who are prone to steal from hardworking folks. And you are asked to determine the guilt of a farmer who shot an indigenous man on his land. How does our mental machinery operate? Are you able to sequester your beliefs about people into one corner of your mind when asked to perceive the presence of a guilty mind in another person? Have any of you heard the name Colton Boushey or Gerald Stanley? I would suggest this is a foundational myth of colonialism, that our courts can dispense objective and neutral justice via the objective and neutral perceptions of our peers. This conception of justice, and there are other traditions with different conceptions, assume the ability of individuals to perceive the world without undue influence from personal experience and beliefs about how the world works. So what does this have to do with cognitive science and decolonizing our faith? Well, cognitive science tells us that perception is always embedded and embodied. Our perception is determined by our physicality, the mechanics of our bodies and the environments our bodies move in. I can speak at length, and this is something I do in other environments a lot, about how the latest science shows that our perception is structured by our cognitive expectations, our predictions, and our biological needs. Neuroscience, along with research into artificial intelligence, has shown that our seeing and our hearing, our choices and our bodily movements are all driven by internal models of how we believe our current physical environments is structured, what we think is likely to happen given choices and actions, and what we want to accomplish. And I would suggest the idea that our legal system can provide neutral justice through people functioning beyond the limitations of their cognitive systems is something we only believe because our legal system is biased towards us as settlers. We do not typically question myths that serve us. I don't have a solution to present to you here today. I'm just beginning to try to piece together how my scientific training and this emerging scientific picture of how human perception works, how that fits with these issues like racism and colonialism. But in closing, I will say this. I think constantly about the question, how do we learn the things that change us? We do not have the ability to see all the ways in which we've been formed by colonialism. I believe that we need to be shaped by contact with people who can help us see ourselves from the perspective that comes from living on the other side of the colonial system. We will also likely not be changed by living the way that we do. If our perceiving is determined by how our bodies are formed in environments, we will likely need to do different things with our bodies in different environments. We will need to learn to walk new paths in new ways.